AAMC's official MCAT study guide. We're going through psychology, and Small's going to teach us about emotions.
Yes, the emotion is the state of one's mind at a certain point in time, and the theories of which are the bane of my existence.
So, theories of which, that's the very, very common thing that you always see on the MCAT.
Yep.
But I guess where else would we start in understanding emotion?
We would start with kind of the three parts of feeling and emotion. So the first one would be cognitive, and that would just be your subjective interpretation of the feeling. We mentioned before that cognition just means thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So your subjective interpretation just means your thoughts on whatever is happening. You have a physiological response as well. So you have arousal, which is stimulated by your autonomic nervous system, meaning that changes in your heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure, skin temperature. All of that actual stuff that happens to your body is something that's autonomically controlled and happens automatically. So you don't control that part. And then behavioral response would be something like a facial expression that happens when you feel a certain emotion, or a certain body language that you put forth. Like if you're slumped over, you might seem sad to someone.
Yeah, so when I'm looking at these, behavioral response almost seems like it's kind of like an outgrowth of the physiological response, but it might also be kind of an outgrowth of the cognitive response. So maybe it is its own thing.
Yeah.
I was thinking to myself, like, it seems like behavioral, facial expression, body language, things like that, those are physiologic things. However, the physiologic response is more of like you don't control it. It's not outwardly expressed. It's just like, you see a lion, cortisol starts.
Yep. So I think this is where the theories come in. People are like, where exactly does each of these come into play? Maybe some of them overlap. Maybe there's, something happening at the same time. I see Tall's.
The wheels are turning when I hear same time Canabard.
Yep, exactly.
So with all of the different theories, we're talking about cognitive, physiologic, and behavioral responses. When do they happen? Which one leads to which? And the experiments that they've done to prove all these different theories. Yeah,
and so the overarching thought is kind of that we've developed emotions evolutionarily in response to things that happen to the human as a species, kind of. And so that adaptive role of emotion states that we have adapted to emotions based on the problems we were encountering in order to respond properly. And I think early on this probably meant in order to survive whatever problem we were faced with. And so when I read this, I was immediately thinking of the caveman or an earlier version of human that was being chased by a dinosaur. And if he hadn't learned to be scared of the dinosaur, and he didn't feel that fear and then exhibit a specific response, then he would not have survived to reproduce.
Right. And so there are these hallmark responses that you see across cultures, the 7 different major emotions and the ways that people can recognize them across cultures. But so I have a hard time understanding then, is it just a social evolution that led us to do that? Because if those things would be like behavioral things, like I can tell if someone's sad if they're from China or if they're from Norway or if they're from Sudan, like sad looks the same.
Yeah.
So was that just we evolved socially so that for some reason it helps us as a species who is a social species?
Right.
To understand our connections with each other, that became, I guess, selected for, that we can exhibit these common emotions that we understand just by looking at someone?
So I think it's easy to talk about when we talk about just like the very basic ones like anger and fear. I mean, fear and like learning to be afraid of things that killed earlier humans is probably the most basic one as far as the evolutionary sense goes. But you're saying for things that's like interpersonal, did we develop the ability to pick up on other people's responses to things and their emotions? Kind of to be a more fit species. Yeah,
like if someone was angry, like, way back, like very early human days, if someone was angry and they furrowed their brow, it seems like there's not any, like, physiologic benefit to furrowing your brow.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking is, like, was it just a social evolution, that we knew that if someone furrows their brow, they're angry, therefore to make a more cohesive society, like leave them alone, don't pester them or something like that, and then we can make a more harmonious society if we can recognize these visual cues of emotion.
I think the fact that we can, you mentioned across different cultures, tell that different people from different cultures are experiencing the same emotion, just kind of fuels Darwin's argument more that, they developed like along the way through evolution. We started with very basic things like fear, and then went to more complex things as we came up with more complex problems. So that might very well be social evolution was kind of a part of it.
Yeah.
But I guess that wouldn't explain, every once in a while we've got humans that don't pick up on the emotions of other people, like really poor interpersonal intelligence. So I think it might be more complicated than that. Huh. But you're right. That's one of those more complicated emotions that we probably would have developed later.
Right.
Because it is an interpersonal intelligence thing.
But definitely the physiological response of emotions that, we see something, we feel this feeling that we see something dangerous, we feel the feeling of fear or something, and that compels us to run away, to get away from it, to avoid it. But then maybe along with that came some of these other emotions that, with us developing emotion, we developed some of these other ones to help us socially.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other ones?
So these are kind of fun to talk about. So we're going to talk about the 7 major ones the MCAT wants us to know, and then also talk about the physiological facial expressions that go along with them. And these are kind of ubiquitous across all cultures. And so we talked about fear. And so what do you think of when you think of someone's face if it's scared?
I think of mouth like agape, not showing teeth, but like more like gasping. Mouth just open, gasping, like eyes getting wide.
Exactly. So that's the 2 things that they mentioned, eyes wide and eyebrows up. And then you already mentioned, having scrunched together eyebrows, pulled down and together kind of denotes anger.
Yeah.
And then, glaring with your eyes also denotes anger. So anger is our second one.
I would also say closing the mouth. Maybe the mouth is only important to me, but that's how I determine a lot of emotion, I guess.
No, that's a way to read people. It's a form of interpersonal intelligence.
Okay.
So the third one would be happiness, which is kind of important. And so that would be someone, if we're going based on Tall's mouth thing, that is smiling.
Smiling. I would almost say like closed eyes, or not closed, but like more because you're scrunching your dimples and stuff so much that like your eyes get closed. Right.
So like wrinkling around eyes.
Right.
Those little laugh lines that we earn.
And these, yes, we do. And these emotions, while we're talking about them, the reason that these facial expressions are important is because on the MCAT they might say the person is exhibiting this thing in the middle of the paragraph, and if you know that they're interpreting an emotion a specific way and maybe that's not how they're supposed to be interpreting it, then that could lead you to understand the answer more properly.
Exactly. And so the fourth one is kind of simple but very useful. So eyes wide, eyebrows up, open mouth, that'd be shock, surprise. So that is our fourth one. And then sadness, we kind of already mentioned some body language for sadness, but for facial expressions, frown, inner eyebrows up and together. And the last one, the 7th one they would like us to know is disgust. So nose wrinkling and or raising your upper lip.
Oh, now I do it to myself? Like that is a very distinctive thing.
Yeah.
You don't do it with any other kind of facial emotion.
So now we get into the theories of emotion.
Okay, this is the I honestly don't know of a more guaranteed area of psychology that's going to be asked, that the most questions are going to come from, than theories of emotion. You're always going to get something on like reinforcement, punishment, all that kind of stuff, but that's normally 1 or 2 questions, probably discrete questions. You're probably going to have, you could arguably have like 3 passages about theories of emotion, and they all revolve around these ones that we're going to talk about.
3 passages is a lot.
3 passages is a lot.
You're saying that like touch into this subject?
Yeah.
Okay, I was like,
maybe not entirely on it.
Well, goodness.
But we have had, I think we had a practice passage that was detailing exactly how Sacher Sanger did that original experiment.
Yep, exactly.
And so the entire, 6 questions that were all about that theory, the experiment that went behind that theory of emotion.
Yep. So the way that I've found is best to explain to others and to study this or review this, I guess, myself, rehearse the information, would be to get a really good graphic that explains all 3 major theories. So there's 4 major theories, but the MCAT would like us to know 3. And so on the left side of the very top of this graphic, there's a snake, and then on the right it shows someone who's scared. Mm-hmm. So there's 3 different ways that people have proposed that we can get to the feeling of fear.
From the stimulus of the snake.
Right.
Right.
So the first thing that happens in each one of the theories is just that you become aware of the snake. That's the very first thing. And then they differ from then on.
Right.
And so I have a silly way of remembering the simplest form. So the simplest theory is Cannon-Bard. And they said that when you see the snake and you're aware of it, you have a physiological response and an emotion, experiencing fear, that happens at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I remember this because cannon, like a cannonball, is one big thing. So they both happen at the same time, at one time.
That also is the buzzword for Cannon-Bard if they say same time.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so the other most common one would be James Lang. It's also a hyphenated word, so they might get a little confusing, but make a silly way to remember it for yourself. Mm-hmm. And so James Lang would be that you have a physiological response before you have the fear. So your heart would start racing, and then you would experience the fear after you saw the snake.
So it's almost like your body needs a specific physiological response to know which emotion to elicit.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with this one a lot. Like, almost like it might take your brain a minute to catch up to what's happening, to start realizing what's happening.
Yeah, it makes more logical sense to me. I never could get my head around Cannon-Bard that they both happen at the same time, but I guess that's more of a psychological kind of approach to it. Like labeling a response that would go back to more of saying that. That we do have these ingrained defense mechanisms that are called emotions, but then psychologically, I guess, based on Cannon-Bard, we would interpret it however we interpret it. While our body is doing what it's supposed to do, biologically, evolutionarily, we also have the psychological part that's doing what it has kind of, I guess, been nature, nurture kind of thing, been attuned to interpreting that stimulus.
Yeah, so they have done studies on James Lang, and we just mentioned that it kind of makes sense to us that emotion might be processed in this way. But if you go off of this theory and someone's autonomic nervous system is impaired, then they would theoretically show no emotion because there's a pathway in which the physiological response has to happen before the emotion can be felt. So if there's no autonomic nervous system causing that physiological response, then the person would have no emotions and just have flat affect, and that is simply not how it works. So they've had patients that have, autonomic nervous system damage. I'm sure they've done versions of this in mice because we do everything to mice, unfortunately. and those patients still had their emotions.
Okay, so walk me through this. So I'm trying to just understand the autonomic thing you were talking about. So let's say that the stimulus is you see a snake.
Yep.
Visual stimulus. It goes into your brain.
Yep.
Your brain then according to James Lang, your brain should send that stimulus to like the sympathetic nervous system, part of your autonomics. Mm-hmm. So, and then that would elicit that sympathetic response.
Yep.
And then, based on James Lang, that sympathetic response, meaning probably a surge of cortisol and, just the really immediate stuff, would then go back maybe and tell your brain fear.
Yeah.
Okay. So what was the mouse study? Recap it again.
So the source that I was reading just mentioned that, in patients that have autonomic nervous system damage, so their physiological response is not happening like it should be.
Gotcha.
So they see a snake and they're not getting a rush of adrenaline through their body,
right,
and they're not having that automatic response, that they would have no emotion, and that's not true. So
they still feel fear or something.
So that's why the Cannon-Bard team decided that it happening at the same time would make sense, because if one of them happened without the other, it wouldn't necessarily negate the other's ability to still be there.
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. And so then Satcher Singer, so I learned this in my high school psych classes, the other. So Singer-Satcher two-factor was how we remembered it.
Okay.
Yeah. And it states that you have to have a physiological response and you have to label the emotion at the same time before you can feel the emotion. It's almost like a processing part to, I'm feeling this explicit response, and I know that this is what happens when people are scared, and therefore I'm feeling fear.
And I think that when we went over this in our practice passage, they said that the way they figured this out was they would like give people adrenaline, but then they would like tell them that it's adrenaline, or they would tell them it's something else, or they wouldn't tell them anything.
Yep.
And so based on that, they could label that when they, you get shot with adrenaline, but they tell you it's adrenaline, then while it's pumping through you, you know what it is, so you have a specific response.
Right.
People who thought it was something else had a different response. So that would make sense that it's a combination of you labeling what the thing is and the actual physiological response.
Yes, and so the group that was epinephrine informed was able to feel the adrenaline, the epinephrine running through their body, and feel the increased heart rate, at not necessarily blood pressure, but feel the physiological response, and then be like, oh, I know this happens when people are scared, but I also just got shot up with epinephrine.
Right.
So this is not me feeling, an emotional response. This is due to what I was just given. So they considered their environment, and then they made a decision, and then they labeled it not as fear. They said it was not, they were not experiencing fear.
Oh, okay.
So they could attribute it to whatever else was present in their environment.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I like to mention, so when I was doing a study abroad in Mexico, there was a student that was with us that ended up getting bitten by a dog that was a really good guard dog for this house. And the pup had been trained to, follow. So in order for you to enter the house, the little compound, he had to come out and meet you, and then he would follow you in, and then you would be a friend to the pup. But if you did anything that was contrary to that little setup, the dog would see it as a threat, and then you would be attacked.
Right.
And so we had a friend who did this, and then a few days later, because apparently I don't learn very well at all, I did the same thing. I didn't let the pup come out and greet me, and without thinking, I walked into the compound, and he you could tell that the dog was like, he was like, I know you're not a threat, but I have been trained to do this. And so he started coming at me, and then he got a little faster, and then he ended up, biting me, and it was like no harm was done, and the skin wasn't punctured or whatever, but I think I was more scared in that moment than I've ever been. But it took me a minute to process what was going on, and I had the physiological response before I realized, oh my gosh, I'm scared. I couldn't figure out what was going on for a second.
Yeah, I think I've had stuff like that too. Maybe not with fear, but I know with some like happiness things, like, for instance, like when you get done with the MCAT, or like when people say, when something great happens in someone's life and they say like it hasn't really sunk in yet.
Yes, yep.
That kind of feels like, well, you haven't labeled it properly yet. And then maybe that's where some disorders with emotions can come in, if you can't properly label a physiologic response.
Right. So that would be where Singer-Satcher two-factor comes in, and we're labeling, oh, I know that this is how I feel when I'm happy. Oh, I'm happy.
Yeah. And
kind of that is the processing of emotion. And so where James Lang said that, the physiological response had to happen before you can feel an emotion, and Cannon-Bard said they just happened at the same time, Singer-Satcher says that you have to feel a physiological response and then realize, oh, this correlates with a specific emotion, and then you feel that emotion.
Okay.
And they decided that the considering your environment was important based on their epinephrine informed, uninformed, and negative, whatever all they called
informed,
it.
uninformed, and I think misinformed, where they told them that it was going to calm them down or something. Saline
solution or something like that. Yeah. And I think they might have included a tranquilizer or something.
Yeah, I think
they did a couple of other studies that supported their work. But So yeah, considering your environment is important. And it's really important to have these 3 down. As Tal said, it will be, it could even be up to 2 passages on your MCAT. So.
It's guaranteed to be on there.
Yeah. And so now we need to talk a little bit about the brain regions involved in the generation and experience of emotions. And so we always talk about the hippocampus as far as memory goes. And that continues here. So we talk about creating long-term memories with the storage and retrieval of emotional memories. There's some other brain regions that are important in emotional memory, but the hippocampus is obviously involved anytime we're mentioning memory. That's one of the way oversimplifications of neuroscience that you get to use on the MCAT. You get to distill an entire brain region down to one theme.
Yes, hippocampus equals memory.
Right, and so your hypothalamus, which our one-word synopsis for hypothalamus would be homeostasis, and so it sits right below the thalamus and releases neurotransmitters that help homeostasis.
Yeah.
And it helps us regulate emotions by mood and arousal.
It can control it's the generator of cortisol release and
melatonin eventually, right?
I think hypothalamus.
Because it goes to the pineal gland.
Probably.
Okay.
Oh, I think so. But anyway, a lot of hormones that are required for either becoming like stressed and aroused or calming down generate from the releasing factors released by the hypothalamus.
Okay, so both of those make sense, and then the amygdala also makes sense. So if we were to boil that down to one word, we would probably also say emotion.
Yeah.
Although they talk about fear and anger is, I think, the 2 most common emotions that they talk about with the amygdala, which we recognize as a gross oversimplification, but a mile wide and an inch deep, people.
Yeah, we're talking about the limbic system. That would definitely be the purpose of the amygdala is feeling fear and anger.
Yep. And then the thalamus, so preliminary sensory processing station, which we always talk about with our, I think our first video was called sensory processing.
Yeah.
So the external stimuli get sent in, and then most of them, minus a couple that we mentioned, get routed through the thalamus and then go to their correct processing stations in the brain.
So that means that emotions would rely on the thalamus sending a stimulus to the right place.
Yep. And so, like Tal mentioned, each of these 4 areas make up the limbic system. So they help us experience and process emotion. And a little mnemonic for that is HAT, with 2 H's, or that. Nope, just kidding, because that would have 2 T's. My brain is not working. Speaking of brain regions.
Let's see. Hath?
Hath. Yeah.
It could be at or ta. Or just hat with 2 H's.
I like that. We'll just go with hat with 2 H's. But neither, there's 2 of them. So none of the 4 are actually too difficult to remember, because we know, even if you boiled them down to one word that summarizes those brain regions, they kind of make sense in how they would help us experience emotion.
Yeah, and that's definitely an inch deep approach.
Yep, and if all else fails, remember that your limbic system is what is involved in this, and if you can remember the pieces of the limbic system, then you're set.
Yeah, limbic system, emotion, but also memory, because hippocampus.
So you have emotional memory. That's also really important. We're going to talk about that in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
So emotion in the autonomic nervous system would just be that you automatically have a physiological response to your emotional state, or vice versa. Whatever the order is based on those 3 different theories that we talked about, you're going to have an automatic response to some external stimulus.
Right. Your body has to feel it, which would go along with an idea, or at least my little hypothesis that I've been developing over the course of this video, that we kind of developed biologically and psychologically to deal with and express emotions.
Yeah.
For different reasons, but it would kind of just make intuitive sense to me that you have to have a physiological response if it is an emotion.
Right,
because
to experience something. You got to feel something.
That's the core of biology and evolution.
So we have an evolutionary biologist at our disposal in Tal, which is very useful with your trees and all of that.
My trees.
Yeah. His bioinformatics prowess is showing.
Phylogenetic trees, not the fun trees. Nah.
Okay, so there are a couple of specific things that we talk about when we talk about the physiological markers of emotion. We've mentioned all of them already. And so these are things that you guys will know, skin temperature, heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure. And then I'm going to ask Tal I'm going to give you an emotion. And then you tell me based on those couple of things that I mentioned, how you think they might change.
Okay.
For each emotion.
And so we're talking about blood pressure,
heart rate, breathing rate, and skin temperature.
Okay.
Like if I am furious that somebody left the stove on, then I might get really hot in the face. I might have a really red face.
Okay. So now I know anger.
Yeah. Well, that's one of them for anger.
Okay. So for the rest for anger, I'm going to say that anger you would have hot in the face. So increased skin temperature.
Yep, which would probably go along with
increased blood pressure.
Right.
And heart rate.
Yep.
And a crease in between your eyebrows that lasts.
Okay. And so what do you think might happen to the skin temperature if you were really scared because an axe murderer just walked in your house?
Well, I only know it's going to go down because of like popular culture.
Yeah,
but
okay,
I do not really know why.
That could help us understand, kind of if you've got that visual of something happening, it's an easy, it is a representative heuristic.
Yeah.
That's easy for us to jump to.
Because if I was Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predator and I was scared of the Predator seeing me, I would cover myself in cold mud just like he did so that his heat vision stuff couldn't find me and kill me.
There you go.
That's how I'm going to remember it.
Okay. And so what do you think might happen to your heart rate if you're happy?
Happy.
Like if I were to sit here and show you puppy videos, like cute puppy videos for like 10 minutes.
So this is a little it almost seems contradictory to me.
Yep.
But it's also because I know about the relaxation response that we talked about with meditation, that your heart rate decreases a lot when you are not stressed, but at the same time I think
happy.
Is that what happy means? So I would guess that if you had to pick between the two, happiness would be a decreased heart rate.
Yeah, I would agree with you as well. And I think characterizing it as lack of distress would be a really good way of saying it.
Okay, yeah.
So very good. And I guess maybe not getting sleepy and relaxed, but like parasympathetically stimulated, just like, not stressing about something. So I'm rested and I'm just enjoying watching the cute little puppy videos.
It's good to think about it kind of like a binary.
Yep.
Like happiness is absence of stress.
And also so there's so many different shades of what is happy for different people and across different cultures and stuff like that. But for the 7 major emotions, really oversimplify it for test day because they're not going to give you something that's like 2 shades of this and 1 shade of this emotion and, do an in-depth analysis of what is this. It's just going to be like, can you recognize a couple of key characteristics of said emotion?
Yeah. It's like you're happy while your brain is exhibiting alpha wave patterns and you're blah, blah, blah. It's like, nah, binary.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to mention is that we have decreased heart rate variability when we are angry or stressed out. And when I first read this, I wasn't really sure what it meant, but Tal explained it to me.
Yeah.
And so it's sympathetic stimulation ensures that our heart rate is extremely stable so that we do get enough blood to our muscles that we need to get to our muscles so that we can run away from the bear.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the dinosaur.
And that's a really useful way of monitoring like stress levels and being able to correlate that to cortisol and to adrenaline and to just a lot of other health problems in general, like sleeping patterns. If you just take your heart rate variability multiple times a day and you kind of see throughout the day, like before you eat, after you eat, when you wake up, when you go to bed, all kinds of different times, if you just keep a constant measure of what is your heart rate variability, then you can start to understand how does your body deal with stress throughout the day and how does that affect all kinds of different aspects of your health.
There we go. And so we said that blood pressure increases with anger and stress, so that goes along with an increasing blood volume which kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And, conversely, it decreases when we're sad or really relaxed. And so sad, I guess it's because it would be like the slumped shoulders, rested, inward kind of emotion. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm not requiring much of my body. Like, I'm not about to go yell at somebody. I'm about to cry in my bed.
Yeah.
So I'm hunkered down and closed off.
And that increase in blood volume, you're not urinating, right?
So yeah, I think that probably would go along with
either
ADH.
urinating or pooping, I guess, because you lose a lot of water through that too.
So I think, with increased ADH, you're going to increase water retention because, when we're running from the bear, we don't have time to stop and go tinkle. So that does make sense.
It would also help with sweating. It would allow you to sweat more. It would just keep more water around if you need it for whatever.
So sweat, and this is way off topic, but I just want to make sure I remember. Is acetylcholine also involved in sweat release?
Ooh, I do not know that.
Okay, I think it has a couple of different functions, but so like muscle contraction is one of the things that's not necessarily parasympathetic.
Mm-hmm.
But it is the major contributing neurotransmitter for parasympathetic. And its other thing that's like doesn't necessarily go along with parasympathetic is like sweat release.
Right.
Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, so diastolic blood pressure, we talked about this already. So it would be the highest in what emotion, do you think?
Blood pressure would be the highest. I would think if I was scared or anxious. Oh no, mad. Anger.
Anger, yeah. I'm picturing that little adorable movie Inside Out.
Yeah.
Did you ever watch it?
I didn't, but I kind of know the premise.
I think it was they did a really good job with it because Disney Pixar always does. I don't know which one it was, or if both, whatever. But I'm picturing that little red guy.
I think it was, Louis Black, I think did the voice.
No idea.
Yeah, he's a really good angry person.
But he was adorable. And anytime anything happened that made the host angry, he would like shoot fire out of his head, I think is what happened.
Yeah.
So that definitely makes sense as far as increased blood pressure. I think he was probably, consistently pretty stressed out. And then the next highest amount would be in fear.
Okay.
Which makes sense. It needs to increase some sort of response to get you away from whatever is causing that response.
Mm-hmm.
And then sadness would be a little bit higher than happiness. I'm not quite sure how to remember that other than if I'm happy, I have decreased blood pressure.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to think about it.
And like happy and angry are two opposites, kind of.
Yeah. So that goes right back to, I'm sure everyone is thinking the same thing. Like sadness should mean like you're not moving a lot. You don't want to move. Therefore, why would you have really increased blood pressure? But if you just think about it from a clinical perspective, like typically when people are really depressed, when they are really anxious, or when they're really like sad about everything, that they do have, like we said, it's a binary. They have increased cortisol. So while you might just be laying down in your bed and you don't want to do anything, you have a lot of cortisol going on, and that's not good if you're just lying down all day and, sad. Because if you have increased cortisol all the time, it's really messing up your daily function, the way that your body's supposed to work.
Yes. And so now we get into the really cool part of the hippocampus job in the limbic system, which it was really fun for me to learn about this stuff. But so explicit emotional memory would be, to me, I learned it as exogenous or outside. So it's like you're looking back at yourself in a situation and you're not physically feeling that emotion anymore, but you remember how you were feeling when you were there. And I think part of that is nostalgia for some people.
So explicit, exogenous, it was something that happened, outside previously.
Right. So and that happens in your temporal lobe. So that would make sense that you're not necessarily feeling that emotion, but you can remember, I was really sad at that funeral, or, I had a really good time at prom in high school. I was really happy that day.
Even though you're not happy
while you're remembering it.
Right.
Right. So there's I don't know where nostalgia would fit in, but you're not physically feeling like that happiness. You just kind of are thinking back on something that, I don't know, because you tend to think back on things fondly. So maybe it would inhibit some explicit memory. That would be interesting. I wonder if they could do a study on that.
I don't know.
So the other one then would be implicit. Bet you didn't see that one coming. So I thought of this as like endogenous, programmed into you. And it's so the emotion that went along with a specific event, you are actually, when you relive that emotion, you are actually feeling it. And so the best example that I read was PTSD. And so if someone had an explicit memory of something that happened to them, maybe in a war or something, they would just be able to think back on like, that was a really rough time. That was really stressful when I was in that situation. This
immediately makes me think of whenever you say 9/11, everyone, like you kind of feel sad when you hear the words even.
Yeah, you remember that you were really upset.
Well, so that's where it gets different. Like, that's the gray area between explicit and implicit.
Yes.
Because if I hear 9/11, I get sad.
So let's come back to that.
Okay.
Because I want to finish the war example real quick.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really important. So if someone had an explicit memory of a bomb going off, they'd be like, that was an extremely stressful moment in time.
Right.
But if they were not in that situation long enough to develop PTSD, or maybe they ended up for whatever reason not developing it, then they would not have the same implicit memory of someone who did have it, where when like a car alarm went off and it reminded them, it like immediately transports them back to that stressful situation. Then they would feel the fear and the anger and the hurt, and all of it would rush back in. So they would have an immediate actual physiological response. And so it's a learned emotion. It's a learned emotional memory, and that would happen in our amygdala.
So does that mean that when someone has PTSD from war or something and then they hear a big crash, are they specifically, like, is their head going to like, that was a bomb? Or are they just subconsciously now getting scared without having to label it as like, that was a bomb?
I'm not quite sure, and I'm not quite sure if it would differ between people.
Okay.
But I think what they're like insinuating here is that it's a learned instinct, and so it would.
It's almost like conditioning.
Yeah. So, and so when you brought up conditioning, that brings up the other term, generalization. And so even though it's not a bomb, it's something that was loud and scary, and
so it's
same response
categorized
no matter.
As bomb.
Yep. Yeah.
Ooh, okay. I can dig that.
Yeah, but I like the fact that you brought up 9/11. So it might be implicit memory for many, many, many people because they had an emotional tie, to it in some way, shape, or form, even if you didn't know someone that was in the buildings.
Sure.
But maybe like 20 years down the road, like barring that a lot of other terrible stuff doesn't happen, which it always does. So, this is like a hypothetical situation. But maybe 20 years down the road, you don't feel that same way anymore. It's like when you lose a loved one and it's been 10 years and you're able to think back on, wow, I was extremely sad at that point in time. I was maybe even depressed at that point in time, but I'm okay now.
Right. So
like it's happening in your temporal lobe, not in the amygdala.
Okay.
You're not physically feeling that emotion.
So implicit comes from the amygdala. Okay, yeah. Okay,
it's a learned emotional memory.
So implicit, while you could possibly go from implicit to explicit over time, implicit means it's got to be you have some stimulus, and it triggers your amygdala to tell your body feel sad, to like the physiological response, like, or feel emotion, like make this emotion happen.
Yeah.
Versus explicit doesn't go through your amygdala, it's hippocampus. Like, oh, I remember being really happy at that point, or or even in the PTSD thing, if someone didn't quite have that but they were there, they said, I remember being very scared when the bombs were going off.
So I don't know. So the first one actually happens in the temporal lobe, which I guess it's the medial temporal lobe. So I don't know if that's part of the hippocampus, but both of these are involved in memory. So I feel like both of them might, because one of them is a learned like memory, and it's actually explicitly but it's distinctly different than regular memory, emotional memory is.
Yeah.
And so these both might be tied to the hippocampus because they are involved in memory.
Okay, but explicit, think medial temporal lobe, and implicit, amygdala.
Yeah, the big one for me, I think, is remembering that implicit is me actually feeling the emotion. Therefore, I can tie it right to amygdala, and I know that most of them are negative, so like fear and anger, which would go right along with the PTSD example. And then the other one I know is not me really feeling it, so it's somewhere else.
Okay.
Involved with emotion and memory, but somewhere else. So that, I guess that would be in the temporal lobe this time.
Okay.
But I think remembering amygdala for implicit is the more important one.
Yeah.
And so I think these might be nitty gritty, but we're going to mention them quickly. And so we said that evolutionarily we developed the things that kept us alive first. So things like fear, maybe anger followed. And then all of the complex human things, we always talk about your prefrontal cortex is what was one of the things that sets us apart from other primates and things like that. And so all of the human things come from that prefrontal cortex development. So our dorsal prefrontal cortex allows us to have better attention and cognition. So, these areas fire when we're taking a test or something.
Right. That's what people typically would associate with the prefrontal cortex, is the dorsal prefrontal cortex.
Right. So I guess dorsal, I have to think of a shark. So like the back of your prefrontal cortex. Okay. And then ventral prefrontal cortex. I don't know what ventral is, but I think it's the opposite of dorsal. So it's the front.
Ventral is your belly.
Okay. So experience emotions. And I write little silly notes all over this stuff. So wearing our hearts on our sleeves made me think of, having your emotions in the front part.
Right.
Of your prefrontal.
The ventral prefrontal cortex basically is like the gatekeeper for your ego, to talk about Freud for a second.
Okay.
So it's like when someone, so prefrontal cortex, we think about like you wrote down there, all the human things, like our social ability, our social cues, and understanding how to work our way and organize our way through our life and our society. And the ventral prefrontal cortex, you could say that someone probably has a problem there if they, let's just say you're a fully grown adult and you throw a genuine temper tantrum at work or something like that. You probably, well, among other things, you probably have some kind of issue with your ventral prefrontal cortex.
Or would this be an example if someone doesn't have a filter of what they say?
Probably.
Okay.
Yes, I could see. Well, once again, because the prefrontal cortex is just almost like another routing station for so many other areas, it would require other things to be kind of wrong too. But it would 100% be in there. Okay. If you had it functioning properly, you might be able to stop yourself from just saying things. And
so ventromedial. So medial, I know, is is it your mid-sagittal line? All the way through the middle. And ventro meaning ventral.
Yes.
So in the front, but the middle. The front
middle part.
Okay.
Yes.
Of the prefrontal cortex. And this would be controlling emotions from the amygdala and helping us make decisions about them.
Yes.
So even though the bottom in traffic in front of me, he cut me off, and I was gonna say another word. So bottom was my filter working. Oh my God,
I did not understand what bottom meant.
Well, I was gonna say a different word. So that was my filter. My prefrontal cortex, my ventral.
That's your ventral prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. So
keeping it PG.
There's a bottom that cut me off in traffic, and what helps me not get out of my car and go yell at him would be my ventromedial prefrontal cortex, helping me make decisions, even though my amygdala was telling me, hey, you're angry. Get angry.
And my father is a psychiatrist, and I actually learned about this a very long time ago. Oh. He has a very unique psychiatry practice. It's more of a neuropsychiatry thing because they really pay attention to actual brain structures and activity of different brain structures to help diagnose behavioral disorders. So ventromedial prefrontal cortex, I remembered learning while I was shadowing him, and it's the exact same example that the person who has a problem there would, if they have anger problems, then this was just to show that if a person has anger problems, and let's just say that they got cut off in traffic and then they got really angry and they like followed the person back to their house, and then when they parked in the driveway they got out and yelled at them or something like that.
Yeah.
That if that person went to a psychiatrist, sometimes the psychiatrist might say like, oh, well, you know, your amygdala's off or X, Y, and Z is off, when really it's because they have a messed up ventral medial prefrontal cortex.
So their amygdala wasn't off because they were feeling the emotion.
Right.
They followed it all the way through.
So if you treat that, or, you know, I'm not entirely sure how exactly a traditional approach would have treated that.
Right.
That wouldn't have done anything because that's not the problem.
Yeah.
That's functioning properly. The problem was that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex was all messed up and it wasn't stopping their amygdala.
So there wasn't almost a filter on the behavior.
Yes.
Knowing that I'm angry, but if I do this other thing, it could be really bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
And despite talking about so much anger, I'm so stoked to take this test. Strong work, Small.